Welcome to another episode of the Under the Pines podcast. I'm your host, Max Magno, and today's episode is a special one. It doesn't happen often that I'll be able to speak to a person that, lived through those crazy 60s and 70s and actually lived through them, being friends with the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix and the Rolling Stones and, then later on as well, living in a monastery and being Lama Govinda's personal student and also becoming His Holiness Lucini Lama's acolyte at Badna Stupa. So, very much in the external on one hand and then also the complete opposite and on the other side of the spectrum going inwards on such a profound level. He is the mystic. He started reading the Bhagavad Gita at 11, which, still baffles me. And he's the alchemist, right? He studied under Coercive, who was a famous disciple of Fulcanelli. And he just talks about all the stories in such a, eloquent way, so much life that he can share and so much wisdom. And so I'm very grateful that, he got to talk to me and we recorded this hour and 15. I hope you can stick through it. I hope you enjoy it as well and share it with a friend. And I'll see you on the next one. Prince Slash, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. I came across some of your quite funny and interesting posts, and I thought, okay, I have to talk to this guy. Very interesting character. And, you carry a lot of wisdom, obviously, with you. And I know there's plenty of stuff that we cannot talk about, like in depth. And I won't even ask you many things that I would otherwise ask you probably in person. But, nonetheless, let's use this, this beautiful interwebs that we have here and, maybe get some knowledge out to people and let's see where it takes us.
Quite, absolutely.
Perfect. So in the era that you grew up in, plenty of people probably have no idea about it because, they just had no touch points with it. Like I was lucky because my father was also a musician and, on the side and had a lot of vinyls at home. So we played a lot of jazz and blues and all these different genres that you actually lived through, like physically. So that's kind of, very interesting to me because you're probably the first one on the podcast that can actually take me there to these moments, and maybe we'll talk about them a bit later. But so you grew up in Switzerland, very interesting family. How was that growing up for you? How was boarding school for you? Was that, because I also went to boarding school for 2 years and, I liked it, but I know some people got sent there because they were sent away from home because they had to go, but I wanted to go. So that was the basic difference there. But how were those years for you?
Well, first of all, you have to realize that I grew up, when they say that people always assume that I grew up at a much later period than I did. I was born in the early 40s, so I was born in 1942 to be precise. Therefore, during the middle of the war, which was a very interesting time. So I lived a lot away from home due to the circumstances of it being the war, parents looking for, having to deal with various housing issues and so on. We lived, having said that, when we did live together with my family in magnificent homes, such as the Villa Diodati in Cologne, which was still intact in those days and still had the materials that Lord Byron had chosen when he was in residence there in 1816, and where Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. So that was an enchanted, magical place. And then, we lived in after that, my mother moved in with her brother, who was the famous Professor Hubert de Watteville, who became a hugely famous gynecologist, perhaps the foremost member of his profession who died in 1984 and was a physician to the stars and the queens, and so there was a lot of international activity going on. Moreover, my aunt his wife was a great eccentric who was a war heroine who, went and rescued children in Nazi Germany from Switzerland. She was an aviatrix, an early aviatrix. She was also a very gifted classical opera singer. So there were very great concerts of classical music as well. When I was a little boy, Paderewski, the famous Paderewski came, and who became president of Poland. He came and played a concert in our home. And there were grand balls and all kinds of things happening. So it was very interesting. I didn't go to boarding school until 1952, when my mother found an estate called Villa Fleur d'Eau, which was a historical place as well, having been a home that belonged to Jean-Gabriel Hénard, who, like Byron, was a Philhellene, somebody who worked for the freedom of Greece and gave millions of gold francs at the beginning of the 19th century to the freedom of Greece. And he's one of the heroes of that, the liberation of Greece, has a statue there. He built a house for a man called Capodistria, who would become the first president of Greece, but was murdered in Corfu and never saw it, never actually saw this house that was built as a custom-built gift to him on the banks of Lake Leman. Very, very beautiful, romantic house. And it remained in the Hénard family and then was sold to my mother. When my mother obtained that estate, we were sent also to boarding school at that time. So we went, we wanted to go to Le Rosé, which was the most famous of all the Swiss boarding schools. But the director of that establishment didn't want us to return home. We could have returned home. It was sort of, as the crow flies, hardly a mile and a half away or something like that. And so it would have taken very short time. We could have walked there, within, would have taken us, it was a little longer on foot, but it would have taken, it would have been almost, it was within walking distance of that villa. So he refused because he said that there were people who couldn't even go home for the holidays. So my mother said, well, I didn't have children to never see them again. So at least on the weekends, I want to see my children, which meant that we were sent to a second-tier school from Le Rosé, a rival school. And it was initially a fairly nasty institution where a lot of, they indulged in a lot of physical, what would be termed today physical abuse, because we were hit on the fingers and slapped and spanked and the rest of it for any perceived slight. So it was, the discipline was quite severe in those early 50s. And it was quite acceptable that the grown-ups would give you, if you misbehaved anywhere in public, anybody had the license to give you a few slaps. And if you cried at home, you got beaten by those who looked after you.
Yeah, I still remember the stories from my grandmother as well. They also got slapped on the fingers like quite a lot. So was that a Catholic institution then, I assume?
It was not. It was a
Was
Protestant.
that
Well, it was
Protestant?
a
Okay.
non. It was sort of a Lutheran. It became a Protestant institution, but
Mm.
then a very enlightened director took over, and it was one of my very first appearances in the public eye because they did a commercial, and I was selected to be the poster kid for it.
Hmm. Okay.
So
So
it was what was great was that it was an international school, so you were thrown in with people
mm,
from all different cultures, from Persia
yeah,
to
which probably
Egypt to
yeah.
all the Arab lands and Brazilians and South Americans of all stripes, lots of Americans, lots of English people, and French and so on. So,
Okay.
it was good
Yeah, that
to be.
made it easy for you later on, right, to connect with people. Because I remember for me as well, it was that is what I learned there, that humans, we're all one, right? Like we look and smell differently, and we all have these different cultures behind us, but in the end there's always a way to connect, right? Even though you seem so completely different. And yeah, that's one good thing I think about school, right? Because otherwise, I mean, like public school in Germany where I grew up was not really interesting to me. Like just
No,
learning
it
by
wasn't.
heart, and
School in
yeah,
general wasn't interesting to
yeah.
me at all, and I regretted one of the bad things was, of course, before when I was going to primary school, I had a gift to play keyboards, and there was a magnificent grand piano, and so I liked to play with the piano. So it was decided that I should learn how to play the piano, and that's when the bad the bad kind of education methods of those days would rather put you off music than uh, teach you
Yeah.
something interesting, because you had to write notes and play scales, and if you did it wrong you got hit on the fingers, so it soon made you give up, which, and the grown-ups had a tendency to consider that one would always, never follow through, never finish anything. And that was a bit of the sarcastic attitude that grown ups had towards us children.
Hmm. So you grew up, you know, in a family of artists, like from your father's side for sure, right? Your dad, and just to name two, your dad and your uncle, both. And like, how do you think, we pass this skill, this talent onto our children? Do you think it's epigenetics, or do you think it's like more the programming that happens, in those early years, what we see, what we hear,
It's a
and
funny question because my son is in the military branch. He became a
mm,
professional soldier, which was also another aspect that existed in my mother's family. My
okay,
grandfather was the head of Helvetic intelligence and there was a big scandal during World War One because the left wing government or the left wing opposition to the government in Switzerland objected to the fact that how these officers, my grandfather and his acolytes ran the intelligence service, and they had connections to the Axis powers, as it were. And it was considered they had my grandfather had been to Heidelberg University, so he was very much like in Erich von Stroheim mode, and had a dueling scar and all that kind of thing. He came from a completely different age. My mother was the baby of the family, so if you went to my great grandfather, you were at the beginning of the 19th century already, which is so interesting, because jump one generation.
mm,
My parents were born before World War One, But my grandparents, that takes us back to the first half of the 19th century, to the second half of the 19th century. And then with my great-grandparents, you're at the beginning of the 19th century. So it's very amazing, we are now speaking in the first quarter of the 21st century, which is about to.
Yeah. Totally.
So there's already 200 years before the time of my great-grandfather and myself. Now, speaking to you. So time is a very interesting construct, and the perception of time is fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's sometimes, when I work through stuff that happened in my past, as a child, and then it affects the present, right? And then you understand, okay, this concept of time is not what we are taught, right? Like it's not what it is, right? Like it makes you question everything that you basically were taught, especially in school, right? Like, what are some of your like daily routines? I mean, I'm sure you meditate on a daily basis, right? And like all the good stuff. If you want to share a bit of that.
I was I had the privilege of having this mystical. I think at bottom I was always a mystic, because when I was 10, 11, I started reading the Bhagavad Gita in French in a Sri Aurobindo translation.
That's
I
early.
was very, very interested in mythology, and that was my favorite kind of reading material, tales from mythology of all countries. And as in the 60s, my own drug experiences, psychedelic drug experiences, were never just hedonistic. Some of them were, but with psychedelic drugs, I never took psychedelic drugs to groove around. I always took them for ceremonial reasons, and therefore, it had a very deep effect on me. And my friendship with people like George Harrison, for instance, of the Beatles, made it that we, talking about such matters in the 60s, was a daily thing. We spoke of ideas, we spoke of the whole concept of within you, without you, and all those type of things, and aspired indeed to get deeper into Buddhist and Hindu philosophies. And that's I had the call at the same time that the Beatles met the Maharishi, and I was invited by a guru from a completely different tradition. So while the Beatles went to Rishikesh, I had preceded them by going to an ashram in the Punjab, near Beas, and was initiated in Surat Shabd Yoga, which is the unstruck melody. And whence I had acquired a knowledge of, I had found a pilgrim's guide, which was not for tourists by any stretch of the imagination. It had a part of its text was in English, because English being the lingua franca in a place with so many idioms as India. So I decided that I wanted to go on a pilgrimage to Kailash in Tibet, which was an impossibility to do so unless one joined a yogic caravan. So I had found a way to do that by going to see a Swami in a place in the Himalayan foothills called Nainital, who led these caravans, and on foot. And so my feeling at that time, we're talking about 1968, was that I would go a little bit like Sir Richard Burton did when he went to Mecca in Mufti, as it were, with oils that darken your skin, with all money and identity papers left behind just in one's yogi robes, and I would become, so I wouldn't have to answer any questions, I would become a deaf mute who couldn't speak or hear anything. So that would take care of any possibility of any authorities questioning who I might be and where I was going. And in fact, at that time, there was a complete disregard on my part of the concept of living or dying, which was a very useful thing, actually. And I had been inspired by a book from written by Lama Govinda, whom, as you probably know, was born in South America of German descent, but was a great mystic, a great scholar of Buddhism. And one of his very important books is The Way of the White Clouds, which was my inspiration not to sign a rock and roll tour contract and a record deal with a band called the Rakes. I was a lead singer, and there was a very promising thing I could have done, but I preferred that. Was where my life forked at that point, and I went off to and obtained these various initiations. Not to be too long on the topic, I did
No,
manage
you can
to
say
get
that.
a number of very fascinating tantric initiations in the process, to live in monastery, to be Lama Govinda's personal student, to become His Holiness the Chini Lama's acolyte and assistant at Bodhnath Stupa, and to be sent by him to various tantric monasteries for initiation. So, I didn't do what people do in the West, which is to get a theoretical grounding in these things by reading other people's material or going to do expensive seminars on what they consider Tantra to be, which has very little to do with what it really is as a mystical practice.
Amazing.
Which led me,
So,
in turn to be
yeah.
able to, when I returned to the West, to explore, to go back to the Western esoteric tradition, and to contribute books of my own to alchemy, and translate texts, and have 4 very successful volumes in both English and French.
Yeah, The Secret Art and The Golden Game and stuff like that, right?
Exactly, The Secret Art for Thames and Hudson, which became Le Florilège de l'Art Secret in French. And The Golden Game, of course, was written first in English, entirely rewritten in a different voice in French, because by then, in each case, I had progressed with the tutelage of Eugène Cancelier, who was a famous disciple of Fulcanelli. So I had, again, a grounding in classical alchemy and how to approach classical texts, which is very different from, say, a pseudo-Jungian psychological tradition. Because don't get me wrong, Carl Gustav Jung is one of my great heroes, but as a person, not as how his books were turned out, manipulated by the people around him. I'm very fond, by the way, of a writer called Peter Kingsley, who writes extensively about how adulterated the texts and the message of such people in catafalque. Kingsley broaches that kind of subject. It's a great deal of fascination to me, those type of things, you know.
Very interesting. So basically, those crazy years that you lived in your youth, did they end then with that trip to, or those trips to India? Was that kind of the end of that era? And then you in your
Not really
30s,
the end. It became, you know, it was just
different?
gave me a certain ability. I never lost. I didn't become, you know, serious, quote unquote. I mean, I did. You know, the 70s came round, and the 70s were much wilder than what people imagine the 60s to have been. In fact, things went much crazier by, and if you will, the early 70s, 1970 to 73, 74, you could still consider was part of the 60s, just like the 60s that people imagine who haven't lived through them don't begin in 1960. They don't begin until, say, the end of 63. 1964 was really the beginning of what people imagine as the 1960s. So you
So
see, there's an overlap on both
yeah,
sides. The 50s
sure.
continue well into 1963. If you look at things like Mad Men on TV, you realize that how strictly conservative America still was in those days. You know, people were wearing hats. It was fascinating when I first went to New York in 1962. Oh my God, what a world! You know, it was just this incredible scene. And because in Paris, I had hobnobbed a great deal with African American musicians, you know, who were there on extended tours. A lot of people lived there for a long time because of the racism of the US. And I became friends with
Miles
people like
Davis and stuff.
Monk and, you know, Charlie Mingus and Quincy Jones and, you know, all these sort of people, the Platters. And, you know, it was a marvelous time in its own right. So going to New York, you still were able to go to Harlem and to go to, you know, to have a true extraordinary musical experience at the Apollo. The reverse racism hadn't yet occurred, that whites weren't welcome in Harlem. So none of that had yet, all of that rather was yet to occur. Of course, in 1963, I also witnessed the first race riots in Los Angeles when I went to and spent many months in Los Angeles.
So what was jazz to you back then? Like, you know, outside of just the music?
Jazz, a very
Yeah.
intense experience. I wish, you know, again, I lost so many years of having been made due to that early contretemps in um, people trying to force me into this horrid mold. You know, I missed out on on a lot of time which I could have employed. I mean, I got great advice by listening, and eventually it was another musician, wonderful musician, albeit the much maligned Ike Turner, who asked me to do something, and I tried playing guitar, and I tried to evade it by saying, "Oh, you know," but I compared myself to my friends, and I said, "Oh, I'm less good. I can't really said, don't say you can't, because that's absurd. You got to. And what he did was he managed to liberate me from my own prejudices that and my own limitations by pointing out that if I said I couldn't, then I painted myself in a corner, which is quite accurate, and instead that I should make it my own. And in so doing, again, breaking all the rules, I was able to get my own sound, and that liberated this old thing about playing this almost superstition about not being able to play keyboards. And of course, now keyboards are my main instrument that that's what I do every day. I play harpsichord, I play piano, of course, but I also play church organ. And I love to improvise in the Baroque mode. For instance, an intuitive music has come through, and it's a bit like turning on a faucet. There's a flow. Of course, you've got to practice. Of course, not everything is great. It takes a while for it to flow in the right way. But one is like an antenna, and you direct the antenna, and when it comes right, it comes right through you, and it's just as is. You've got nothing to do. And what I think this approach to music is very important, because a lot of highly trained musicians have found it hard to liberate themselves from the constraints of what they had to learn. So they had to unlearn a lot of these things in order to be free, because otherwise you're an interpreter of scores. And if you've learned to play an instrument in the classical way, you find that people like to play other people's songs, and it's very hard to get into some original music. I'm interested in wholly original stuff.
Yeah. You just spoke about, those experiences that you had with the psychedelics, and that you were basically doing, these under a different purpose, right? Because like usually people do it, in a recreational way, right? And, like, including me, where I lived in London when I was like 20, 21, and it's just a different angle, right? Like all of a sudden this whole world opens up, and like, because you just talked about constraints within the music, right? Because I think there's constraints on everything, right? And if you haven't seen it, right, like we're light bodies, right? Like we're connected to the divine, but like people, if they don't know about it, they will never understand that there are these constraints, right? So
Exactly, because
yeah.
yeah, because people think about themselves in a way which is an incorrect one. That's the fundamental error. One should realize that our identity selves, the how we grew up and the rest of it, is how the parts developed in the fiction of our lives. That our own innate reality is connected to what I have termed the absolute elsewhereness of being, which is that connection to the divine, which is accessible and which is one's true identity before one is born into the flesh, into matter. So that there is a wonderful liberation once one adopts what Krishnamurti called freedom from the known. Freedom from the known is essential to inner standing, as opposed to mere understanding. Inner standing, ego freedom, not egolessness, because egolessness has led a lot of people to extremely dire consequences where they've blown all the fuses and it's like a man who decides that he doesn't want his vehicle anymore in a place like Los Angeles, for instance, where you can't walk anywhere, you need a vehicle. So the person goes out and shoots the car in a stupid way to get rid of the vehicle. In other words, the ego is a vehicle. I couldn't be speaking to you except in a telepathic manner and something completely different, unless one was relating through our instruments. But those are instruments. Those are not what we are, not who we are, what we are. And that distinction, that discernment, is what I strive to, in a sense, impart in any serious exchange. Otherwise, it's better just to have fun and to, that's why I wore for so long the mask of the Playboy Prince, as opposed to trying to impart anything serious, because it becomes exceedingly tedious and boring to do so and to talk to people about these matters unless they're interested in it. And you obviously are.
Yeah, totally true. I mean, it's like talking to a wall, right? And it makes no sense because you just like you get nowhere and you're just wasting energy on just like you said, on tedious conversations, right?
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
okay.
why,
So
talking about alchemy, for instance, people always
yes.
say, oh, you got to teach alchemy. No, you can't teach alchemy unless people have a genuine opening. It was never meant to be taught. It was, on the
Mm,
contrary, there was a strong deterrence from the in the books that are written. They're written as a kind of enigmatic challenge. So you have to learn the language, you have to learn, compare and find out where they agree, where they disagree, why they agree, why they disagree. And that's how slowly you get into a form of understanding about this. I was particularly interested, in the graphic expression coming from an artistic family, as you say. It's how they express these things graphically was, and rather than in words, that old idea that was born with the Renaissance, that the Egyptian hieroglyphics were a language that spoke through the eyes directly to the soul without going into any kind of discursive mode. That kind of thing fascinated me, and it allowed for an extraordinary encounter with the origins of the language of emblems. Where I'm sitting now, in this castle of Monte Calvello, there is especially the 15th century apartments are a mine of this extreme treasure trove of what it's like to be in a philosopher's dwelling. There is a coded language, and it's indicated in very subtle manner that you should interpret this in that key and not in that other key. It's magnificent, but it takes years of practicing that way of thinking, as it were, of as you said, it's a kind of meditation. It's not a meditation where you sit and just do a routine. It's a constant reflection where you're inspired by what your senses bring to light.
beautiful. So that because you say magic is the highest philosophy and you practice it at all times, right? That goes into that.
Yes, I do, because
Yeah.
it's not like the kind of ceremonial magic where people attempt protect themselves from they divide the world into a Manichaean evil entities and good entities and vice and virtues, and then they try to force so-called evil entities, demons and the like, to do their bidding, which is a very, very dangerous path. You're going to exacerbate something that lives as a sort of idea, which is harmless if left on its own, but when you bring it to the fore and give it your own life, these things take on an unexpected life of their own. And our teaching, for instance, in these incubation, visualization chambers, was that you would start by being in the dark, and you would then learn to actually visualize colors so that your senses perceived another kind of reality where you were bathed in the colors in a given order. So you were suffused with, say, an intense blue, the sky, the deepest sky blue you can imagine. But here you are sitting in darkness. And now in the next moment, of course it takes a while. When I say in the next moment, I mean, when time doesn't count, you are now suffused with a light that comes from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. And you can see your body in that light. And so there is a very intricate process where you're building up visualization until you are able to conjure forth very complex systems. And to the point that you can see certain things, but so clearly that it becomes as clear as the two of us talking, but now even more so if you were sitting in the room with me right now, and I could reach out and touch you. It's as like that. There's no difference between what you have elaborated and the so-called other person you could meet. So the only difficulty is that you have made that come alive. So you have to be able to exactly regress it in good order, because otherwise you have created something that takes over, a magical reality that takes over and occupies this space where nothing was, and you're like the apprentice sorcerer, the classic thing with the brooms and the water and all that, except that it's much more dangerous than that even. And the price is your own so-called sanity there. So our teaching was, in these matters, was that you needed to not coerce entities into doing their bidding, but being able to absorb whatever negativity there was, and with the true practice of unconditional love, which is again something that I've spoken on, that what human beings call love, and the love with a capital L of the mystics, is of quite a different order. And in fact, the two have nothing in common but the name of something that in one case is an illusion. In this castle, there's a marvelous room called the Room of Loves and Friendship, where they depicted it as Cupid has thrown down his bow and arrows and cries to the Virgin, not to the Virgin, to Venus, his mother, having, and it's called that theme, very famous, is called the Tears of Eros, because the ancients meant to say that sooner or later profane love made one cry, and they aspired in that case to spin you in that same room. There is a depiction of sacred love. In that case, the Christ child is showing the golden fruit from the tree of life to us and to his mother, the Virgin, the Madonna. And it means in emblematic language that the way of Christ is the way to eternal life. That's how that civilization expressed it. The principle, as you can see, remains the same, that there is a sacred form of love which unites rather than divides. Whereas, the infatuation that goes by, that is misnamed love, usually can, when you're disappointed, turn into its very
Divide.
opposite. So it's not really
Yeah.
love, is it? Right.
Yeah, it divides us in a sense, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
All
What
these
were some
things.
of those? Yeah. What were some of those turning points you would say in your life? In your learnings, and I'm sure you've had probably some kind of mentors on the way. But like, do you remember
Yes, I do. I can
what
tell
those
you
were?
one thing. I had, as a small child, before I knew anything about anything to do with sexual relationships or such things, I had an affinity for, and a kind of innate recognition. I had visions of the goddess as a very small child, as this, when I say visions of the goddess, I mean to each and every one of us, the ideal, if the feminine manifests itself as the anima, as to use Jungian terminology, which is quite accurate. The anima is sort of the feminine ideal within the archetypos, the archetype. And each and every one of us will see, in manifestation, will see the goddess under a different guise. No two of us will see her exactly the same way. So when it's always very difficult to convey those distinctions. But if we realize that, and we don't try to convince the other person that our inner, our magical image, the imago that is made within us, is not one that one should impose on others, rather than the idea that it is there. If we are in a dark room and there's a switch there, uh, and we never thought of just reaching out and flicking that switch, then we kind of go around the room. We don't even know that there's electricity available, and we go around the room stumbling across furniture and trying to figure out where we are. That is very much the case, whereas it's just a flick of a switch and suddenly everything jumps into a clarity where you no longer bump into the objects, because you are getting a perception of what is what in your environment. So that's those are key things. When I met, I suppose it must have been probably 1969. I had a brand new car, and was a beautiful sports car, and I drove up from my mother's house to Sarnen in the Bernese Oberland in order to go and listen to Krishnamurti was speaking, and I was very impressed by how he spoke when he said, he spoke of himself. He never said, I, this or that. He avoided it by saying the speaker, and made a distinction that was very profound. At the end of his lecture, I went for a walk in a little forest. I thought, I need to take a walk in nature, practicing mantra meditation. And I was walking along this forest, and lo and behold, Krishnamurti himself came on the opposite path. And we came in front of each other. At that point, we looked at each other in the eyes. For the longest time, it was magnificent because Krishnamurti had such physical beauty on top of it. He had the longest eyelashes you ever saw. He had this countenance that was simply glowing. And I marveled at this apparition and you know what he said? He said, you know too much. Stop. Now you start. And it took me quite a while to figure out what he was saying. It seems flattering at first to be told you know too much. No, it's just don't let the known, don't approach things from a known approach. Approach it at all times. Now you start anew. You don't look at things from a prejudice, which means a prior judgment, a prior opinion of who and what things are. So that takes us very far afield into something really, really interesting about the nature of consciousness and approaching things quite differently. Lama Govinda, Lama Govinda was another dear mentor of mine. I was so naive in the days when I first became a student, full of a kind of love of the exotic for the exotic's sake. And at one time, Lama Govinda, there was a certain circumstance that would take far too long to relate. I could relate it, but let me just cut to the chase for your listeners who might not have the time to listen to a very long tale about this. But he said, as we were parting, he said, be careful on the outside. So I said, Lama, what is the outside? And he said, aha, the outside is the inside veiled in mystery. That is a very profound statement if you consider it without, just let it sink within you. The outside is the inside veiled in a mystery. In other words, we make an erroneous distinction between that we think is within us and that which is without us. In fact, we perceive so-called reality as a masked version of what we see within. So that was very, very important. Eugène Cancelier was my alchemical master, imparted some very important things about how to approach alchemy in the correct manner, how to consider its principles in a very poetical way. The attraction repulsion, mutual destruction type of thing of substances that are opposites that are brought together and that initially will clash until they destroy each other and they then dissolve. And the principle of that dissolution, things like he who knows the dragon also knows how to vanquish it, are very, very important concepts for practical purposes, which also apply on the inner planes. Because in alchemy, people, you ask your friends or your very intelligent people, what is alchemy? They'll immediately think what everybody thinks, process to transmute base metals into gold. That is the least important of the wonders that the acquisition of the Philosopher's Stone can bestow. There is within the absolute, everything has a perfect form. And the restoration of that perfect form to that perception of the archetypos, the pure form as it's meant to be washed from the aggregates of errors in perception, constitutes the universal redemption. It's a rather lovely thought, and that came from, if you will, from a distillation of all those ideas. I sort of elaborate, in my attempts to convey these things in my own books and now in an oblique way on social media. I'm proposing kind of entertaining ways to absorb these things so you don't sound like some sort of crazy person on a soapbox.
Yeah, maybe that's the way to get more people to think about these things, right? Like, because if you go too deep right away, it's just like so far off, people won't
No,
understand
you
anything,
lose
right?
you lose people right away.
Yeah.
I have a friend who is very intelligent, but as soon as he opens his mouth, he falls into a quagmire of verbiage of such complexity that most people can't follow what he's saying. So it's always good to give simple examples. Like the
Sometimes it
calm, the
also depends,
tripod.
how you want to live, like, and you want to be by yourself or you want to attract more people. 'Cause, I mean, you when did you move to that castle? Because I assume you want the solitude, just like me. Also started up buying land here in Croatia. I'm not too far away from you, like basically just across the pond, and also want to live that secluded lifestyle more and more. Um,
My father,
when did you
my
realize that?
father had wanted to acquire this castle in the 60s because when he was the head of the French Academy in Rome at Villa Medici, position he was appointed to by General André Malraux, was General de Gaulle's Minister of Culture. Initially, he was advised to refuse it because there were no credits and so on. And then General de Gaulle was very keen that he should accept, and if it was a matter of obtaining, public funding to do what my father saw necessary to do this restoration, he would be granted it. So my father could no longer refuse the appointment, sacrificed a great deal of many years of his work. And why I'm telling you this is because he didn't think his tenure would last almost 17 years. And he thought that he would be through in a few years. He loved Italy, which had given him a lot for his art. So he was looking for a place big enough to fulfill his imagination and his imaginative requirements, and also to be able to do his work on a very grand scale. He was brought to this castle. The people didn't want to sell it. He bought it finally in 1970. 3 years of restoration of that place, which was in terrible shape, brought out all its beauties, uh, and after that, he did spend one uh, long summer holiday, only to discover that the climate was unsuitable for him in the summer, and that the doctor said you should spend summers in the mountains. And my father ended up having to, uh, well, going to summer in the Alps, found a place there, restored it, the famous Grand Chalet in Rossinière on the way to Châteaudet and Gstaad, in what they call the Pays d'en Haut. And it became his primary residence because he had a studio built to measure. At the same time, he wanted my brother and I to take over the castle and perhaps to live there, but we were still too young in the 70s to appreciate the countryside and all the things. So it was my brother spent quite a bit of time with his wife Lulu de la Falaise and hundreds of friends, and they would come for several weeks at a time. I never did for the longest time. I would occasionally come and go. I did some of my alchemical work here on my research and so on. It was a great place to write. But when my father died, to make a very, very long story short, when my father died in 2001, he had already transferred, did a division of his earthly goods between his children and the woman who would be his widow. And he had given my brother and I this castle, which was a bit of a, oh, great, you have a white elephant on your back now. But when my father died in 2001, Italian friends said, "You're a criminal if you don't spend more time here." And that's what happened. I ended up spending much more time in Monte Calvello from 2001 onwards. My wife became enamored with, she never lived in the country except as a little girl. And she began to enjoy it more and more. And now, we spend practically almost 6 months here every year, and since, of course, the pandemic intervened, and she was stuck at a property she built in Australia. I was at my Malibu beach house, which is my own. I'm domiciled in California, and it was fortunate because in California I had a wonderful library, even more instruments than I have here, and I have quite a few here. But it was a great, great place to be stuck in a lockdown, so to speak, because it was just the ideal place, to play, to read, to meditate, to do all these things, and to be, at my house in Malibu. You hear nothing but the waves. There's no cars going by or anything like that. So it was a wondrous thing. But, people say, well, do you prefer California or do you prefer Italy? Neither, it's where one is that counts, because I
Sure.
have the privilege of living in two wonderful places and I don't really fancy traveling or any of that stuff anymore, because at my age it's just more of a chore than anything else. I travel for work, but not for pleasure, or certainly not for tourism. I hate tourism. So,
Yeah.
to go to a
Yep.
hotel for a vacation or
No,
something, nothing could be
horrible. Me
worse
neither.
in my mind.
No, me neither. I'm done with that. I traveled a lot in my 20s. Also was in India and a lot of places. So now I have kids, and now I'm kind of on the other side of the spectrum.
Right.
But yeah, Malibu, I was there also. I had an American girlfriend in my 20s, and we spent some time there. Beautiful, beautiful place, very calm. And then now my wife, she has Italian roots, so I love the Italian people, and so I understand why you're there and why you want to spend time there for sure.
And and it is an inspiration because it is singularly
Yeah,
beautiful here. The environment,
yeah,
these hundreds of years that look down on one. The castle starts life in the 8th century. Of course, people always insist on how old it is, but it's even older than that, because there was something there in Etruscan times, in Roman times. There are fragments of,
mm,
statuary, columns, and so on that have been found here on the grounds. At the same time, it develops from a medieval military structure, defensive structure, into a Renaissance palace already in the early 1400s. So you have this wonderful development. And through the 16th century, those great artists come here and do magnificent frescoes. So you are
yeah,
looking everywhere you look. It's the walls have that, carried with all this, and the vibration of this house is
mm,
is really positive. It's not a sinister place by any stretch of the imagination.
yeah. You wouldn't be there if it weren't positive.
No,
I'm sure of that.
exactly.
Yeah. So the avoid the tyrant like the plague, right? Now makes even more sense.
Right. And it's funny that there is
Yeah.
that affirmation in a castle of the church, because the tyrants at the time could be the pontiffs as well.
Mm,
Well,
yeah.
there was always a rivalry between the emperor, who would be also another. The Holy Roman Emperor was potentially also um, a tyrant, and so was any potentate, in fact, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. The saying is very,
100%.
very true.
Yeah, it's always hidden in the solution, right? For the masses.
Yeah. And
Hasn't changed.
demagogy is what all these things, all these concepts, these corrupt concepts, like whatever they are sold to the public as something that is really for them, but in actual fact, it's always something that benefits. You sell the idea to the public to be elected and then cling on to power for those who can benefit.
Totally. Yeah, nothing changes in that sense. It's always the same. Yeah. Okay, okay. And now you're doing a podcast and you have a Substack.
Yes, I'm doing Ken Rutkowski, who's a marvelous radio host and can elicit lots of interesting content from me, in like you did in conversation, but we talk about, it's of course a shorter and less intense thing in a certain way, but it
Mm,
gets into some profound truths as well. So I have my team has built this website, princeash.com, and I encourage your listeners to go to it, because they will find how we developed, with Sandy developed on my behalf, this Substack platform, which is rather beautiful. And she's put a lot of effort in beautifying and presenting varied content on an everyday basis, which goes from philosophy to erotism to, I wrote a couple of fiction books which were never completely completed, but which I've been inspired to work on again. And so a great deal of it was already written. So I revised that content, and we started serializing it, which will be like, like uh, Flaubert or somebody putting something in the newspapers of the time. And, little by little afterwards, nowadays you can escape publishers with their stupid ideas of how to cut corners and make a book as cheaply as possible so they can make the money. I can have a really beautiful book offered on subscription, and that is a great way to give samples to the public, and they can enjoy reading these things. I also have a vast amount of a book called Unchained Memories. Unchained Memories was something that I started years and years and years ago, and like Penelope, Ulysses' wife, who was waiting for Ulysses to return home to Ithaca. She had all these suitors who kept saying, "Look, your husband is dead, marry me," and so on. So she said, "Yes, when I finish this tapestry." So in a Penelope vein, I tried to write down a kind of everything that I remembered about the past, and make an entertaining story. But after a while, you get, what's the point, and you don't like what you've written, and you tear it up and so on. But I did manage to have a vast amount of material, which is very entertaining. And of those, I'm taking excerpts, and in the end, I will complete 1 or 2 volumes of that work, and be able, with the photographs and all that, presenting it in volume form as a physical object. But that's in the future, because at the moment we're doing all these things to encourage a subscription-based platform for writers. Substack is marvelous. So, all this information, I'll be most grateful to you if you direct your listeners who are interested in what I have to offer, even musical offerings and remastered recordings of mine. All that will be, if they go to printstash.com, they will then have this all this information, because I have to make another, in that vein, another caveat for people. Please don't be misled by scammers who adopt my name and in a cheeky manner are trying to offer all sorts of services, to the gullible, and say, well, pay me and you'll get this and that. And some people have been foolish enough, alas, to succumb to that.
Yeah, it happens.
Which is very sad that people would do, would be, it's what a strange age. I wanted, before I left California, I went to my bank and I said, I'm getting these funds. Can you transfer this sum to this place and that sum to that place, which I need? They said, no. What do you mean, no? I can give you a written order now. No. And the bank manager says, if I executed what you're asking me to do, I'd be fired tomorrow. So I said, well, what's going on? We used to do it like that. They said, not anymore with AI. And fraud online, we are compelled to have you come in personally to record you on video and everything, and to triple check that it is you signing the order and you're transferring these sums of your money to such and such a place. It can no longer be done from afar unless you've made prior arrangements.
Sure.
Which are quite lengthy and tedious. But that's where we
it's
are.
crazy times.
It's extraordinary.
Crazy times. Yeah. And they can fake your voice and literally, do these calls for you. Like, it happens a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, we have to be wary of this kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, did you think that this era would like still be enjoyable by you? Like basically, 40 years ago, did you think you would still kind of live through this, or
No,
did
I
you
didn't
even
think.
grasp?
Hey, I didn't think I was going to live when I was 22. I mean, I was still 22. Brian Jones had already turned 23 when we became friends.
Yeah.
We both said we're not going to live to 25, and so burn the candle at both ends and the middle as well. And so here I am, 60 years later, virtually, 60 years, almost next Easter, it'll be the 60th anniversary of this august meeting when we were co-topping the bill against the Rolling Stones and
Paris.
there were so many other bands. It was what they called vedette américaine at the time. So there were all these other acts who would play one song, two songs, then there was a magician with rabbits out of the hat and all that kind of thing. Then we came on, played our full set. Then there was an intermission. Then the Rolling Stones had to come on and follow, which wasn't always such a great thing to do. Chuck Berry was once the top of the bill, and Jerry Lee Lewis preceded him, and Jerry Lee put fuel all over the piano and set fire to it and went and said to Chuck, "Follow that, boy," because, and like the Stones had to follow James Brown, on the Tammy Show. Not an easy task. And they had a hard time following us. And in fact, even their fans, we played several gigs together on that Easter weekend of 1965. And they were in the wings watching what the hell we were doing, and on one occasion, they played a Bo Diddley tune, Mona, which somehow bored the public, and they started booing and calling us back in the middle of their set, which was rather hilarious.
Crazy. That was in Paris, right?
What? In Paris at the Olympia night, Easter weekend of 1965.
Crazy stuff. Okay, beautiful. I mean, we could go like, for hours, I think, because I have a lot of stuff that I want to ask you, but I think you have to go.
Ask me, if what's the time? I think we've run out of time.
Yeah, we're over. We're over time,
But look, look, if you want to do another one, just write in and we can follow through with some questions if they have any. And it was my pleasure thank you for having me on.
Well, it was such a pleasure to talk to you. I'm very grateful that we found the time. And and I wish you all the best, and I'll talk to you soon.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. God bless.
Thank you for watching this episode to the end. If you got any value out of this, please like and subscribe or share it with a friend. This would help the channel a lot. Thank you for that. And I hope I will see you on the next one.